to introduce a longtime friend, John Smith. He and I have known each other for at least 20 years, I think. Through him, I got to meet his daughter, Amber, who's here, and she downplayed her background, but she's worked with a couple legislators in the area as a legislator, and now she's working with Swiftmud. She's here almost every week. Am I allowed to say that? But she's a real rock star in our community and somebody who gets things done for constituents wherever she works. So he did a good job raising her. John spent many years as one of the leaders in marketing at Tico, who was a very creative person along the way. Can you stand up for a second? Anybody guess who he looks like? Anybody?
Robert Redford.
So for two or three movies, he was the stand-in for the person he calls Bob, Robert Redford. So Robert Redford liked him because he looked like him, and he'll tell you the movies probably, but there are some movies that if you watch them, you will see him in the background standing in for Robert Redford, so that Bob could hang out at the concessions or whatever. But John has always loved to study American history, American Revolution, and got me interested in it to some extent. And now he's written this book about Abigail Adams. You all remember the John Adams book was wildly successful 20 or so years ago, and his mini-series was successful. So glad he wrote this. One last thing, we had a PowerPoint up today. Our rule for speakers is that we don't allow PowerPoint, and I had several people say, wow, we're excited that there's PowerPoint today. The reason we don't have PowerPoint is because so many organizations have a set PowerPoint and they give it to every social group. And what we say is we want a different presentation than you're getting anywhere else. And we don't want a CEO to get up and just like kind of boring go through the slides. But if you really like it, you can try to allow more to experiment with it. Just come let me know. But the reason that we have this today is with John's permission, he's allowing me to tell you he has Parkinson's disease. And you'll see a little bit of shake and maybe a shake in his voice. And we're a group that supports all different kinds of backgrounds, especially people with disabilities. He's not really speaking very many places right now, and his daughter and I both coaxed him into coming today. And he said, this is a very friendly crowd who will be interested in what you say. So please keep us up to that. But with great pride, I want to introduce John. He will have 20 or so books in the back if you would like them. I think he can sign them as well. Welcome, John.
Yeah, I was a photo double and stand-in, so that's a tough job. We did a walk in the woods and a couple of other moves. And yes, he's a nice guy, really nice, but you get in trouble if you call him Mr. Redford. It's always Bob. But I'm here not to talk about that subject, but to talk about another person, and I'm straying off of my script already to quickly make a point of what I'm here doing. I was in a bank. I walked into my bank a couple days ago, and we're setting up a Zelle account. I have the book with me, and we're setting up the account for this, and we're talking, and she said, she was typing, and she said, oh, can I ask you a question? I said, sure. And she said, who's Abigail Adams? So they're not teaching, of course, American history or the Adams family or anybody in modern schools, which is the reason why my book is out there and other people. But real quickly, in 2 years, it's going to be the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And when I retired from Tico, I thought, well, for sure I'm going to write a book about, it's one of my favorite subjects, the American Revolution and the founding era. So I'll write a book about it, but I also want to make it about a person who was actually living in that time and saw it with their own eyes and maybe took part in it. And so when I retired from Tico, I knew I was going to be doing that, but who would be the person? Because if I wanted the person's words to frame the whole book and hold it up, who would that be? I would need a lot of letters. But during the pandemic, I started reading the letters of who? Abigail Adams. She wrote 2,300 letters in her lifetime, all with a quill pen, of course, and sometimes frozen ink. She had to defrost the ink. But something like that was an interest to me. I started reading her letters, and they were amazing. They were very good. George Washington letters were very, very dull. But Abigail talked about everything going on, and so I decided to do the book on her, and Matt's going to help me out with the slides. We're going to work through the slides. Some I'll go into, but some we'll just get the high points up. Okay, Matt? So I'm going to have to turn you back on you a little bit. The question was, this can be for the lady in the bank table. Who is that? Who was Abigail Adams? By the way, her maiden name is Smith. Right? And so the intelligence, the IQ bar was set about here as I started talking to her, because she's a Smith. But as a child, she was a bright, self-educated girl. But as an adult, she was the political policy aide to her husband, President John Adams. John said he couldn't survive without Abigail by his side. And many of the people, and I'll get into that in a second, but many of the people who had business or visited with President John Adams, it was well known that you had to go through Abigail first to see John, and that was set up that way by John and Abigail over 50 years of marriage. She was a successful importing, marketing, and financial expert, and this is all she's self-taught, don't forget, and a lifelong proponent of women's education, but an ardent proponent for the abolishment of slavery. And it's ironic, she grew up in a house with 3 or 4 slaves in it, but when she turned 20 and got married, she became over time a huge advocate for abolition. She thought slavery was either a sin, and at the very least, it couldn't fit in with the morals of the United States. Now, and we won't go over those, and they're all in the book. In 20th century speak, she would be considered a single supermom, because while John was either in France as a French ambassador with the United States, or in Congress in Philadelphia, he was constantly gone from their marriage. He was gone more than half the time of their whole marriage. But Abigail had to stay home and run the farm, do all the work for running the farm, and educate as the wife's and the mother's job to educate the children. She was doing all of that. Matt? And after reading some of the letters, some of the 2,000 letters, I just think that she was the most extraordinary of all Americans. And most people think, well, no, it had to be Thomas Jefferson or Washington. But no, if you read her words, it's Abigail Adams. And she could hold her own with anybody, then or now verbally. And she was intellectually strong, spirited, idealistic, and practical, and she should absolutely be thought of as one of the founders of the United States. During those times, most men didn't want an intelligent wife. We won't go into that. But, and they really resented the fact that John not only had Abigail by his side almost always, but deferred to her on most policy and most cases. She was a better source for people in politics than John was, and he knew it. And they're a team in the greatest sense of the word. And Abigail's known mostly, of course, for the letters that she wrote, over 2,000 of them. It was for women of the time, writing letters was an art. And first you write the letter, you go back and revise the letter in grammar and spelling. They didn't have an eraser, so they had to blot things out. Abigail was too busy and in too much of a hurry. When she wrote a letter, the example there is what you got. And she would say, the letter is trash, and tell the recipient to burn the letter. And I'm glad they never did, but that's the way she was. Matt? But the thing is, I found out Abigail's letters were censored for about 160 years until just recently. By 1840, there was a big demand in the United States for her letters, to read her letters. And her grandson, Charles Francis Adams, collected all of his grandmother's letters and published them. But he censored any words or subject that his grandmother would make his grandmother or the whole Adams family look bad. And so it was, when you read those versions, it's pretty vanilla. But when you read her letters, you go, no, he didn't really say that. I'll show you a couple of examples of it. And by the late 2000s, the Massachusetts Historical Society, where most, if not all, of Abigail's letters reside, started publishing the uncensored full letters. Man. So in her lifetime, Abigail wrote more than 2,300 letters from 1762 to her death in 1818. And when you read them, she had such a great style. Again, she was self-taught. The letters show things that are historic, tragic, sarcastic, and funny. And more importantly, from a historical standpoint, her letters serve as the best eyewitness accounts of American Revolution home front and the nation-building founders era. And of course, she was right in there helping to create all of that. Man. The late David McCullough said, the best thing about being a historian is you get to read other people's mail. So, and I really abused that when it came to Abigail. Thank you, man. And we'll jump over this, but Abigail knew or met in her lifetime George and Martha Washington, and she absolutely adored both of them because they were just beautiful people. And of course, John was vice president when President Washington was president, and so they saw each other quite a bit. She knew Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Franklin, she wasn't impressed with when she first met him, but he was having a bad day, I think. And Paul Revere, can you imagine? Sometimes he would get on his horse and write letters from the Congress in Philadelphia to their house in Braintree. So imagine having Paul Revere as your mailman. But she did. John Paul Jones, I won't go into detail, but it's in the book, as so many things are. When she first met John Paul Jones, she was shocked, and it got worse from there. And I'm toying that with you, and it's in the book, but I won't go into detail. But her impression of John Paul Jones was very different than the swashbuckling pictures we see in the United States. She got to know King George III and Queen Charlotte, but the one person that she met, and John was right in with her, was Alexander Hamilton, and they both hated, and I can't say the word strong enough, hated with all uppercase, Alexander Hamilton. Abigail, of course, was very religious, but she believed in a pseudoscience of the time called, I'll get it right, physiognomy. Physiognomy. And what it means is you can read a person's soul by looking deeply into their eyes. And she used physiognomy on Alexander Hamilton, and what she saw in his soul was the devil, basically the devil. But Abigail's known mostly for 3 words that she's written in history. Remember, she wrote a letter to John as they were writing the Declaration of Independence, and she said, remember the ladies. And she's reminding John that if we're doing a complete revolution, you need to give ladies a break and remember them, because she wasn't looking for the vote. She didn't even think about women voting then. She took one step at a time. What she meant was we need protection for married women from abusive husbands, which was rampant then. A wife had absolutely no, of course you couldn't own any property or money, but they had no physical protection from their husband. And the husband was safe from any type of law enforcement. So she said, please do something for married women. And it was called the law of overture. And what it means is it's belonging to the husband. Everything the wife had belonged to the husband's man. So throughout the book, there's certain stories that I'll just tease you with, of course, but each one is, you're amazed at how modern they are. She had a long episode of sexual harassment, and this is going to be hard to believe, it came from a congressman. I mean, some things never change. And John, in fact, never knew about this. He was in France. And this congressman probably signed papers to send John to France. And so, through written letters between both of them, she put up with a lot of sexual harassment. but she would turn it back on him very skillfully. She had a case of neighborhood racial discrimination with their hired hand for the livery stables of a young black boy, and the story is just incredible in the book. Even today, she owns some houses which she bought with John and her money, really John's money. And she had a squatter go into the house, and it was impossible to get the squatter out. She had, again, a married woman, she had no rights, not even with the law, and illegal squatter. And there's a great story of while John was in Philadelphia, pushing people to writing the Declaration of Independence and pushing people to vote for it, she, of course, was back home watching the house, and a huge smallpox epidemic was rolling into Boston, and they closed Boston, and she had to get the 4 children, friends and relatives in a wagon, go into Boston, and they all got inoculated while John was, and she'd take care of the family, while John was doing his thing in Philadelphia with the Declaration of Independence. Matt? One of my favorite quotes, so much so that I put it in the book, on the cover of the book, was, "I am not apt to be intimidated," and that's a tough one. And real quickly, why I brought that about was after the 1776 loss of the Battle of New York by the Americans, up and down the eastern seaboard, people were running from their homes into the interior of the country. And they thought Boston ships were going to start shelling all of the main cities in the United States. And so John wrote a letter to Abigail and said, if the British are beating down the door, take the kids, and he said, fly to the woods. And she wrote him back and said, I'm not apt to be intimidated, I thought that was such a sign of a strong letter and really symbolic of her that I put it also in the title. And at Massachusetts Historical Society, they have almost all her letters, and they let me take a picture of that particular copy, and you're looking at her actual thing when she wrote that. And I first of all, I love her handwriting. It's really good handwriting, very specific. But that's the actual phrase, I'm not apt to be intimidated, Matt? Abigail was one of my cases that I make for the book, which the title Chief of Staff wasn't invented yet. It wasn't invented until the Truman administration. But for every side and purpose, she was the Chief of Staff when he was President of the United States. And it's well known, of course, that to get to John, you had to go through Abigail. And she was a tough cookie. A lot of people, delegates from other countries, congressmen would call her Mrs. President, and they had a lot of names for her, and they were all respectful of her, the fact that she ran a tight ship. And again, she was a better judge of people in politics than John. So she became the president's chief editor, proofreader, writer, and policy expert and advisor. And don't forget, she self-taught herself. Matt? So as we wrap this up, I used some of the words that were censored out by her grandson. And I'm not even using the worst ones. Amber talked me into taking those out because they're not fit for anybody. But after meeting a delegation of Creek Indians visiting the president in Washington, she wrote, "These very fine-looking men have a fine shape." And I thought, Abigail, what are you doing? She said, you can't do it. She's writing to her older sister. And she reported that long before she saw Paris, I smelt it. It was the very dirtiest place I ever saw. And this was even before the Olympics were there. And to her uncle Cotton Tufts, who was also her financial advisor and taught her the ins and outs of making money. And I paraphrase this. She wrote it more formally. Basically, she said, "Oh, by the way, please buy me a couple lottery tickets. I don't care which ones." So Abigail played the lottery. Real quickly, why you did the lottery then was instead of raising taxes, different state governments had a lottery to build canals, to build roads, and so on. And so she obviously was not only chipping into for that, but buying a lottery ticket. Yeah. And I bet you never knew her grandson, William Sterling Smith, became a pirate sailing the Caribbean. When I read that, I said, what? That was never in the school books. I don't remember that. And when John had retired from the presidency, Abigail complained in a letter to her sister again that John was, the only thing John was doing was sleeping and reading romance novels. I'm thinking, that's something, again, we never heard in the history books. And every morning, she gave John a sniff of cayenne pepper to get him going. That would be good. Yeah? So that's just a very brief introduction of just a fraction of things that, did I mention there's a book for sale? Abigail Adams. A woman not apt to be intimidated. Any questions?
Before we get started with questions, I'd just like to announce or recognize one of our Café and Tampa regulars, Judge Matt Smith, is newly reelected.
Abolitionist. Did she free her own slaves?
Well, John and Abigail, when they were adults on the farm, made it a strong practice, and people got to know it after a while, that if you have to work off a debt, a legal debt, so you cannot send slaves over. They didn't have any slaves, but her father, who was a Congregationalist minister, freed his slaves, but the main slave, I think her name was Phoebe, and he freed her when he was dying. And he said, here's a bunch of money, you can either go live by yourself, or here's a bunch of money, you can go live with Abigail, who grew up with Phoebe. And Phoebe took Abigail. So Phoebe stayed with Abigail and the family while John was gone for, I think, about 20 years. So, but yes, he freed him through different means, but took care of him when his death was coming up again. John and Abigail refused to have slaves, which was very unusual at the time. Obviously, a Congregationalist minister had slaves.
Would you characterize this as a history book?
I'm sorry?
Would you characterize your book as a historic?
Yes, but I would think that you learn a lot about history accidentally when you read the things that Abigail was writing, because again, she was living it through the founding era and then the whole Declaration of Independence and everything.
So my real question is, if we are to learn from history,
Absolutely.
what did we learn that we should do, and more importantly, what are the mistakes we should not be repeating but probably still are?
I think women really in this decade are just starting to get respected as individual people. And they were, again, less than real people. They couldn't own anything. And I'll quickly go into that. If you were a woman and you got married, and let's say you inherited a business from your father or bought a business, as soon as you said, I do, you didn't own that stuff anymore. The husband owned it. And they were treated less than regular people. They had absolutely no rights in court, like the illegal squatter. John wrote a letter to the constable of the town and said, take care of this, get this guy out of the house. And the constable went out and told Abigail, I can't do anything because John's not here, and you, of course, don't have any rights at all. That's the way it was then. So that's something that's just changing. And but the good part was, and I need to go back on the subject again, but slavery existed in all 13 colonies then, certainly in Massachusetts, because they were the main, even though they didn't have as many slaves as in the South, an agrarian society, they made money on the shipping, building ships and sailing the ships during the slave trade. And so everybody had a stake in it, and that's something that should never have gone on. And Abigail did her best to make her feelings known.
Congrats on this, John. I'm always impressed by people who have an idea and see it through with the flow. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. It's actually interesting to read. I was amazed all the time. And again, it's a good way to pass the pandemic when we can't go outside anyway.
So my question is, how did Abigail become such a strong and spirited woman, married at 20, and you said, was she informed by her parents, her faith, her education, something in her background, or was it just who she was? Did you get a sense from that in these letters?
I'd like to give a real slight answer saying this person was her main mentor, but she had two other sisters. There's Mary Earl, but she was the middle sister, and then Betsy was the third one, and she had a brother. And there was no influence from them. There's no influence from some other people that she knew. Her mother was a bit of an influence because the father, being a congregationalist minister, the wife, her job was to go around and tend to the flock, and Abigail went with her, and that's where she learned compassion and all those things. But to say that there might have been one person or one situation which made her into the person she was, because she's certainly way different than her two other sisters and a brother, that it's just one of those things that you're born with it. And of course, undeniably, as soon as she got married, John not only supported her, because she got in trouble with the Congress and with the state officials occasionally from time to time, but he supported her in every single decision that she made. And he encouraged her to read, ask questions, and she got to the point where she, on some subjects, she knew much more than John did. And John, instead of being threatened by it, encouraged her to read more. And there's so many funny stories and interesting and poignant stories in there showing that if there was a person, John Adams certainly pushed. He was very proud of his wife, and he shouldn't be. He's the one that pushed her to know more, and use it whenever you can to make our family better, to make the state better, and the country better. Good morning.
I can't help but think that she would be absolutely livid to know about the $1 billion successful musical Hamilton. Did she give any feedback in her letters as to why she just hated him? And then the practice that you mentioned, it sounds very witchy, and I'm kind of curious with her intellect and with her stern, self-possessed nature, how she kind of avoided, that stereotype of having too much power or having too much clarity. Just the insight on that.
You mean too much for herself, or? And I'm sorry, I didn't quite get the first part of the question. I'm sorry.
Why does she hated Hamilton so much?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I'll take the easy one first. She knew where the boundaries were of what, because you don't want to make everybody mad. So it was a fine art of how much power do I have, knowing that a lot of men don't like that. In fact, she was a writer for John Adams, many of his speeches and policies. They kept him quiet because if men found out that a woman had written it, that would have been the end of that right there. Because it's actually a truth that, and you'll be ready for this, many men thought that having too much power, or if you're too smart as a woman, it actually affected your reproduction cycle. So, and it got worse from there, how women were thought of during that time. Alexander Hamilton, they were mad at him. Many people were mad. Obviously, he was shot in a duel. Many men were mad at him and many people during that time because he'd do anything he felt to do, they had to do. Specifically, when John was running for president, after George Washington said 2 terms is enough, he was working violently behind the scenes to kind of sabotage John being president. And then, of course, in the year of 1800, when John was running for re-election against Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton was behind the scenes doing some despicable and they both knew it, and they didn't appreciate it whatsoever. And so and there's many more things also. But yeah, Alexander Hamilton, to both John and Abigail, was the devil. And there's more stories in there too. I voted for you, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Not because you're a Smith, but because you were the best.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I will say this in Hamilton's defense. He did write a great Federalist paper number 78, so you might want to check it out. I'd say that he has no likely judge. Quick question. So, a lot of us have read and taught that Abigail was heavily involved in melting down computerware to big bullets during the Revolutionary War. There's a lot of cartooning and caricatures that depict her with the firearm. What was her knowledge, for lack of a better term, of firearms? Was she at all a hunter, or did she have any involvement? Constantly, you'll see photographs, like drawings of her, and a lot of times they're cartoony. And I don't know if that's trying to pay homage to her, helping during the Revolutionary War, particularly making bullets and such. Or was she an accomplished shooter? Was she a hunter? I have no idea. I was just curious if in your research you found anything.
Well, the scenes you think that might have happened of the family taking all of their pewter and spoons and cups and melting it down and creating bullets actually happened, and it's the way it happened in David McCullough's film on that. But she, as far as being a hunter, of course, when John was gone, she had to do everything. And yes, she, without going into detail, her letters talk about shooting and missing, and our ammunition's running low, and should I keep it for the British or shoot the wild pig? And so the rifle not rifle, as a musket, kept above the fireplace, was up there away from the children, but it was up there for a reason, either the British or to hunt for dinner. So her firearm, like many more people, almost always at that period, it was for self-protection and feeding the family. And that was, without going into detail, that's what she accepted and just did as a matter of living day to day.
Hey, you barely mentioned she had a famous son. What influence did she have over him, and was it more or less than John?
I didn't hear the last part.
I said, was it more or less, did she have more or less influence over her son than she did over John?
Her son, John Quincy? Yeah, that's a complicated situation. She knew that all of her 4 children, of course, Nabby didn't count, she was a girl, so she was expected to become a good housewife. So you kind of put her out of the picture. Her other sons, John Quincy and Charles and Thomas, she educated them, of course, more than the girl. But yes, her morals and her demeanor, and this is again another show that kids develop differently. No matter what you do, you're the same parent to all 3 of them, but they develop.
I've got a question, please. Can you speak about how Abigail dealt with the fact that her son, John Quincy Adams, left for Europe at a very young age, 15 or 16, I believe, and if she advocated for it or against it at that age?
Charles went to, along with Thomas and John Quincy, went to Europe, and he was exposed to the same things that his 2 brothers were. And John had taken all of them and enrolled them in Leiden's university. But Charles dropped out and went back to the United States. Without saying so, David McCullough gave the heavy influence that Charles may have been gay, and there's a lot of evidence towards that. I kind of stay clear of that in the book. I might mention it. But he may have been gay, which in those days you didn't make public, and in some places was against the law. And so Charles always felt a little bit out of place, and he left Europe, came back to the United States on his own, got a law degree, but he made his life terrible by alcoholism, and it got, after he became a lawyer, it got worse and worse and worse. It ached Abigail, as it would with any mother, to see her oldest son descend into that. And he was living in New York City in a flop house. And Abigail would go by when she was visiting her daughter, who was dying from breast cancer. She would stop in and see Charles and see if there's anything she could do for him, but he always rejected her. And just got worse and worse and worse. To John, who had just been elected president, one thing you don't do is you don't leave your family. And the other thing is you don't drink and become kind of a jerk. And you did both. And he actually gave his son up and said, "You're no longer a son of mine." And with his volcanic, it was called a volcanic sense of anger, when he said, I renounce you, he meant it, and he never went back again. And Charles died shortly after that. And in fact, his gravesite is unknown. Where he's actually buried is unknown. So he was kind of a miserable person. But what brought it on was, who knows?
Did Abigail support John taking the kids to Europe?
The question is, did Abigail support John in taking the kids to Europe? Yes and no. I mean, yes, because what an opportunity to learn the collection of Western civilization in one place. But no, because when you traveled across the Atlantic Ocean in the dead of winter, the ship sometimes would run into a storm, and it was such a storm that the frost and ice would develop on the ship and actually flip it over and sink the ship. And unlike today, where you can't put out a distress call, in 1780 there was no distress call, and everybody would die, and there would actually be no record ever that what happened to the people. They would just vanish from the face of the earth, and after 2 or 3 years, the people would know, that they must have died. She, by the way, I'll put another plug for Abigail. She was deathly afraid of deep, dark water. And there were few bridges in the United States, so whenever she traveled to Philadelphia or New York, you had to travel over some pretty big rivers. And she had to get all her gumption together and close her eyes and get over those rivers, let alone a 6-week voyage across the Atlantic in winter. There's a lot of stories in there about that 6 weeks and what she did, and seasick almost all the time.
What she gave the First Lady. Her most lasting legacy of the First Lady.
That women have rights, women can be smart. In some ways, women can be smarter than men. And that's what she was living in and lightly preaching it. You had to not push that too far, or you turn the whole thing against yourself, but she knew just how far to push it. I have a real quick story about the rights of women. The biggest thing that Abigail ever did in supporting women's education and having women being thought of as not only equals, but maybe superior, was her will. 2 years before she died, she made her will, which that was illegal right there. You don't have anything to give. Why are you making a will? She did a will, and it ended up that she had quite a bit of stock in bridges and canals and roads and quite a bit of money. The 21 people that she left items to of hers were all women who she would expect would take their gift back, and maybe she would start to spread that feeling that women can be equal to men. And she made it that way in her will. She gave it to 21. Her daughter had died already, so it was 21 relatives, friends, and acquaintances that she knew. But her will alone, her final will, says what she thought about how she was going to support women from that point on.
I'm a bit puzzled because I've always known that she was a very strong woman and an intelligent woman, the gatekeeper to her husband. And now your comment about her belief in the rights of women. And yet, in probably the area that is most revealing, which would be how you live or how you treat your personal life, you said that she was somewhat dismissive, but there was far less letters to her daughter, and the expectation was her daughter was going to marry a rich man who was going to take care of her and everything else. And is that a contradiction or a disappointment maybe?
I would look at that situation as I would expect her to do that. Because, yes, it's true that she thought of women and practiced to women that they were equals and they were smarter in some cases on some situations than men. But her own daughter, she did educate her. Her name was Phoebe. Well, it'll come again. Her own daughter was educated far above other girls, but her daughter also didn't want to become this. She wanted to be attractive to boys, and boys were not going to be attractive to her if she acted smarter than them, or actually was smarter than them. And so you can take a horse to the trough, but you can't make him drink. She didn't really want to be educated, and that forward to her future husband, whoever that may be. And it ended up that their marriage was kind of okay, but not really. And Abigail didn't like the man that she had chosen for her husband, and then he didn't really support her when she had breast cancer, and then died from it 2 years later. Which the breast cancer thing, like medicine in those days, was just a. If anybody has seen the John Adams, the miniseries, they show the breast cancer operation, and some people have to leave the room because it was anything but pleasant. And she died from that, and so that melted Abigail's heart for saying anything against her husband, of course. It's just, that's why people of that era, for the most part, were dictated all the time by the fact that life was really short, and it was very short in those times. And you could die, or somebody close to you could die at any time from the various epidemics that rolled through town, from accidents were just all the time because there's no ocean or anything, back then. And so she also gave in to that, and when her name was Mammy, her nickname. And when Mammy developed the breast cancer, that ended her feelings against her husband for being kind of a lazy jerk. So.
Well, Lisa over here at Puerto goes in on behalf of Café from Tampa. We appreciate the very long presentation. And we'll see